the final provocation of the conference. I'm delighted with our final provocateur. Alex Sarian is the CEO of the Arts Commons in Calgary and the author of The Audacity of Relevance, which is very, really spot on to the conversations we've been having for the past 2 days and will continue today. So please join me in welcoming Alex Sarian.
Thank you, David. Thank you all for being here and for having me. It's such an incredible honor. It's wonderful to be back in a city that I got to call home for 2 decades and see many familiar faces, many friends, but it's also an incredible privilege to be back representing my new home in Calgary, Canada, and actually having many familiar faces in the room as well. For those of you that don't know, Calgary, Canada is the home of the Treaty 7 lands, which is the traditional lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Yarhi Nakona, the Tsuut'ina First Nations, and it's also home to the Otipinsuwak Métis government within the province of Alberta, districts 5 and 6. That may be the first time I've ever said that without tripping on myself. But the reason I mention that is because even though we talk about these as traditional and ancestral lands, the language that I just shared about the Otipinsuwak Métis government is language that was developed in the last 12 months. And so I think about what a privilege it is to watch Indigenous communities govern and evolve their governance in real time. I also want to give a special shout out that I am, before coming to New York in 2002, I was raised in Buenos Aires, Argentina. What? That's right, okay. And I was gonna say, former board member of ISPA, Ricardo Kugler is here, right? Where is, okay, yeah. And I just wanted to give a shout out. Ricardo and I, 25 years ago, went to high school together in Argentina. And when I was 15 years old, I played probably the best tevye that Argentina has ever seen. And yeah, well, where are you? ¿Dónde estás? Sí, es verdad, no? Okay, and Ricardo was the head of the backstage crew. So it's taken 25 years, more than 25 years for us to reconvene. So ISPA, thank you. I'm here for just selfish reasons. So, you know, it's an incredible pressure to provocate such an incredible group of colleagues and leaders. And so I thought I would, and it's great that it's the last day because I can shake things up and then you won't see me again. But I wanted to share a little bit about why I wrote the book, The Audacity of Relevance, which David mentioned in my intro. So, you know, for those of you that aren't aware, Arts Commons, literally last week, we started construction on the largest cultural infrastructure project in Canadian history. A project that includes an expansion, indoor-outdoor spaces, and a renovation of our 560,000 square foot facility. The project is just shy of $700 million, and it's been creating a lot of news for obvious and for very exciting reasons, not the least of which is that last year we also announced the largest philanthropic gift to the performing arts in Canadian history, which in a country that is perceived to be overly funded by the public sector, we are starting to have really interesting conversations about how to shift the business model. But it was important for me to write this book because as Canadians and people around the world started paying attention, I wanted folks to realize that this shiny new edifice and this beautiful new campus, which people in this room are, I'm looking at Josh, and people in this room are responsible for bringing to life. I wanted people to understand that it's not just about a shiny new building. I wanted people to understand, and I wanted to convey that the reason we are breaking all these records and the reason we are having so many successes, knock on wood, is because we are having very different types of conversations behind the scenes. And that anything that we build becomes the new physical manifestation of who we are becoming as an organization and hopefully who we are becoming as a sector. So, and obviously the pandemic was the prime time to be having these conversations. The other reason I wanted to write this book, which in and of itself is kind of a provocation, is because I noticed within our sector and within our world a lot of digging in of heels. And there was an article that came out in the Globe and Mail, which is the Canadian national newspaper last year, which I feel could have been written in any of our cities or in any of our markets. And the article was essentially a laundry list of why it was becoming harder to run arts organizations. And, you know, the lists included post-pandemic audience behaviors, it included evolving trends in philanthropy, it included escalation, it included inflation, essentially all the reasons why it's getting harder to do our jobs. But nowhere in that article did it point to a lack of an evolution in leadership as to how to navigate these new circumstances. And so I was getting very frustrated with our own community and with my community because we seem to be very content to just sit back and say, oh, it's everybody else's fault. My question, which is something that I ask myself every day and I ask of you, is, well, what are we doing about it? Yes, it's getting harder. That's not going to, you know, nothing we do in this room will make inflation go away. And if you do, then please let me know. But the question for us is, well, what are we going to do about it? So the idea of relevance came up, which is something that I had been thinking about for a very, very long time. And for a couple of reasons. Like trust, relevance is never up to us to decide whether we have it or not. We don't wake up one day and say, you know what, I'm feeling relevant. It is something that has to be earned, that has to be bestowed upon us, whether individually or institutionally. The other thing I love about relevance is that you never really arrive, because if you are relevant today, that does not guarantee relevance tomorrow. So it's this constant state of inquiry. And the other thing I love about relevance, which I'm interested in navigating with this room, is that by default, relevance is kind of hyper-local. And I think we've all seen, whether productions or shows or leaders or individuals, that might be incredibly relevant in a certain community and then just not resonate with a different one. And so to me, what is relevant in New York isn't necessarily relevant in Calgary or in Buenos Aires or Mexico City, but the process and the exercise of attaining relevance can be similar, and I think we do have a lot to learn. And because I think at the end of the day, it does require a humility, again, whether it's institutional or personal. It does require us to have a commitment to asking the right questions rather than feeling we are entitled to having the answers. And ultimately, I think it creates a necessary and well-needed shift in power dynamics institutionally and regionally. So this book, which is called The Audacity of Relevance, is essentially me in conversation with people that are far smarter than I am. But every chapter is essentially a deep dive into an aspect of our business: programming, fundraising, advocacy, marketing. And the through line is asking people that are on the periphery of the arts world how they define relevance. And because I'm fascinated by questions, I tried to weave this question through, which by design is a trick question. So it's bound to get many of you upset, and I apologize in advance. But the question that I asked over and over again of all these experts is, what do you think is more important, the intention of the artist or the perception of the audience? And normally what I do when I give a talk is I ask people to self-identify on either one of these extremes, and normally it's very clear. Like when I'm talking to a group of marketers, normally it's the perception of the audience. When I talk to a group of artists, it's the intention of the artist. But I think we understand, and I don't want to do it here because I don't want to be responsible for the fights that might ensue for the rest of the day, although that would be a provocation. But I think we can all agree that the magic happens when we embrace the tension between those two things. And I think we've all been in a room and in a venue where we look at the beautiful and excellent artwork happening on stage, but what is truly magical about the experience is watching how that influences the people in the room. And that to me is where magic happens. That to me is where that tension comes alive. And it's fascinating because I leaned into this idea of relevance because the word impact is not enough for me anymore. And I know that we still talk about impact and it's important, and we have annual reports and we need to measure our success. But to me, the word impact is very one-directional. And I think a lot of our institutions are always asked a very well-intentioned question, which is, what is the impact of your institution on the communities that surround it? And I'm like, okay, well, we can talk about all of so many metrics. The question that I'm far more interested in, which is far more difficult to measure, is what is the impact of the communities that surround us on us? And do we have folks within our immediate vicinity that can look at our institutions, can look at the people that work there, can look at the work on our stages and say, I see myself reflected because I see the influence I can have on them. And so to me, this idea of relevance, of that tension, of embracing that dialogue is so much healthier and actually a lot more difficult than talking about this idea of one-directional impact. But the other reason I landed on this question is because, so two things that I think are fascinating. When you talk about the tension of who is delivering and who is receiving, and we talk in the arts world that there's this gray area which is beautiful and the magic happens and the tension happens. Well, I come from a background in education. My original career goal was to be a first grade teacher. And I was actually a very good first grade teacher as well, in addition to Tevye. But the first thing you do when you go to school of education is they say to you, if a 7-year-old is not understanding the lesson you are delivering, it is never the student's fault. So all of a sudden there, you have this idea of like, okay, well, if the intention that I'm trying to convey is not being perceived as intended, then it is on me to tweak the message. The other point in my career where that tension came up was at a very, very intense HR workshop, where the HR consultant said to a large group of us, they said, when you are facing workplace conflicts, who do you think has the right? The victim or the perpetrator? And I was like, well, there's no question. And they're like, oh, even if the oppressor didn't mean it? Yeah. So there are all these scenarios outside of the arts, and I think we see it in our day-to-day life where the act of having conversation is dying. The act of being able to have, and in some cases for good reasons, and in some cases not. And I think those of us in the arts still have the ability to create that space where dialogue happens, and that can be messy, it can be difficult, but I think it is absolutely our place to lean into. So this entire book was built around the idea of relevance, the idea of who has the right, who has the power, and I want to go through some of the chapters and just share with you some of the things that I learned, which were fascinating to me. And I want to start with the value proposition, because I feel like unless we crack the nut on the value proposition of why we do what we do, everything else is just lip service. And so the very first chapter looks at the library system in Calgary. And I'm pretty sure that you can all think about and reflect on the library systems within your own communities. Although I will say, if you ever come to Calgary, please come visit the Central Library. It is one of the most stunning buildings the world has ever seen. Right? Okay, good. So I feel validated. But when you talk to the CEO and when you understand why it's so beautiful, you understand that, again, it's not just the physical manifestation of an antiquated system. It is a reckoning that the library system has had when you think about the history of these buildings that were designed to essentially be transactional. And you hear the beautiful words coming out of the mouth of the CEO of the library saying, we had a come to Jesus moment where we could either decide to stay the course and be stubborn, or redefine our value proposition and evolve and be in service to others and have actually the community define what they need out of us without it being mission drift. And hearing her talk about this stubbornness and this idea of letting go, I was like, man, I wish the arts community could hear these words. Because oftentimes it feels to me, particularly in times of tension, where we just hold on. And I get that it's sometimes out of fear. I get that sometimes it's because we don't know what else to do. But looking at our library systems is such an amazing and beautiful lesson in how to just redefine our value proposition to be in service to others. And when you go to this library, you can see, like, this library has a playground inside of it. Because single moms said to the library, I want to be able to go to the library, but I can't afford daycare. So the library said, okay, we'll provide it. And for the people that wanted that quiet sanctuary space, they said, okay, we'll provide it. And so there's this beautiful evolution that seems to be responsive to community. And it is succeeding, at least in Calgary. And I wonder, how is it that we can respond to that as well? The second chapter I want to talk about briefly is programming, which feels relevant to us right now in this room. So when you think about the question that I asked, what's more important, the intention of the artist or the perception of the audience? Again, these are trick question because I'm just highlighting polar opposites. But those polar opposites do exist in our day-to-day. And I'll give you two examples. Many, many years ago, I was talking to a friend of mine in Germany who happened to be the artistic director of a company, of a theater company. And he would say to me, almost gloating, he was like, listen, I could do it was over drinks. So maybe that offers some context. So he would say to me, he was like, listen, I can program an entire season of the most amazing Brecht shows you have ever seen, not sell a single ticket, and I would still get my government funds. Now that times are changing, so he may not be saying that today, but I would say that is a very real example of an operating model that is lived on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, I will shout out my brother-in-law, who is not in the room, and as far as I know, this is being recorded only for archival reasons and not for public dissemination. But my brother-in-law is an incredibly successful event manager, and he runs these YouTube conferences in Florida. And they make ridiculous amounts of money. And what he says to me is, the business model is clear. He says, we take YouTube celebrities that have at least 2 million followers. We call them up and we say, listen, we're going to fly you first class, and we're going to give you 15 minutes of stage time to do whatever it is that you would do in front of a camera. Brush your teeth, play video games, and you would not believe the families that drive across the United States to go see these conferences. It is getting to the point where teenagers would rather go to this conference rather than go to Disney World. And he says to me, you're looking for those 16 to 24-year-olds? I got them. But you got to do this. And he says to me, we're not curating. We're not, we don't have some sort of programming vision. We literally give people what they want, regardless of quality and regardless of what. And so that to me is another example of that end of the spectrum coming to life. And both seem to be alive and well, and even maybe within our own worlds. Which begs the question, what is the role of the programmer when we try to lean into that middle gray area surrounded by tension? And what I propose, and which many of you I know are already doing, is to say, how do we re-envision the programmer as a facilitator? How do we think about programming as the coming together of people where we know that artists are doing incredible work, but we know that if we put it in front of the right audience, magic happens. So again, there's that humility which requires us to not be these arbiters of excellence as we have tended to be, but rather acknowledging that we are bringing folks together and building community through that exchange. The next thing I want to talk about is the experience economy, because one of the things I feel, and this is what I love about having worked on this book, is that the experts are from around the world. So nobody can look at this and say, oh, this is specifically for Canada or specifically for the US. We all have a certain dependency on earned revenue and ticket sales. What the mix is might vary, but I think our operating models are in flux. So the experience economy, I'm so happy that wasn't me. That's what, no, you're good. I panicked. No, you're good. That would have been fabulous. No, it's, you saw me blush. So the experience economy, and I speak to one of the original founders of South by Southwest, and he says to me, people are going out more than ever before. He says to me, I'm not going to talk about Taylor Swift, but he talks to me about this idea that in 2023, the New York Times coined the phrase funflation. And I'm sure many of you have heard this. And funflation is essentially this economic phenomena that goes in the face of every economic study of the past 50 years that says in times of crisis, people tend to diminish their spending disposable income. And we've seen this in the recession of 2009. We've seen this for decades. But what's happening now, and it's a combination of, I think, the pandemic, and many of us know, is that people are literally going into debt to have these experiences. And so what he says to me is, just because people aren't going to your shows doesn't mean they're not going. So you need to figure out how it is that you are going to tap into this, because I think we, again, going back to my earlier comment, we have this tendency to say, well, audiences aren't just coming back. And I'm like, that's true of our worlds, but they're going places. In fact, they're going into debt to have these experiences. Why aren't they doing that with us? The other side of that coin from a revenue perspective, of course, is philanthropy. And you know, I get it. It's getting harder to fundraise regardless of what market we're in. But in this chapter, I interview the CEO of Giving Tuesday. And she said something to me that I will never forget. She says, giving is up worldwide. She said, you in the arts love talking. There's this phrase that you in the arts love saying, which is donor fatigue. And she's like, let me tell you, the data shows that donors are not fatigued of giving. If anything, they might be fatigued of you. And so she was like, how do you learn about evolutions in philanthropy? Why are people giving? And how do you all of a sudden put that lens on the work that you do in the arts? And listen, as somebody with a background in education, I have spent a lot of time in rooms where people say, well, why do we have to talk about the arts through the lens of social impact or economic impact or educational impact? Because the status quo isn't working. And we know the work that we do changes lives. We know that the work that we do changes cities. We know that the work that we do makes communities stronger. Why don't we talk about it? A, it's the right thing to do, and B, it's proven that when we start talking the language of philanthropy as it evolves, the floodgates open. And we're seeing other sectors within the nonprofit sector benefiting from that evolution. And again, for whatever reason, the arts tend to have just clenched down. And there's that stubbornness again. Belonging. One of the most amazing things, one of the most amazing experiences when I went to Calgary was spending an incredible amount of time with Indigenous elders. For my own education, for the education of Arts Commons, and in true fashion, the New Yorker in me got to Calgary and I was like, we needed a reconciliation strategy in 6 months, let's go. And I'm sure many of you already know how that story ends, which is many elders sat me down and said, that's not how it works. It's gonna take you as long as it takes you. And you may never get it. And so I sat down with these incredible Blackfoot elders, which by the way, a year and a half ago, one of them blessed Argentina leading up to the World Cup, and we won. So they are very good friends now. But I would sit down with them, and I would spend hours and hours, and I still spend hours and hours with them. And I was fascinated by, you know, one of the first things they told me was, they said, listen, in the Blackfoot language, there is no literal translation for the word racism, because it is unfathomable that any creation of creator would be more important than the other. So why would we do that? And so he said to me, you might be working on a reconciliation strategy, but if you get this right, you are actually becoming a more welcoming place for everybody, out of a place of generosity and candor and radical candor. And he said to me, there are 3 areas that we think find parallels between the work of Indigenous communities and the way that we see the world and the way that we live and the work that you're trying to do within the arts. And over time, I've come to realize, he said, you know, when we smudge to kick off a meeting, what we're doing is we're sanctifying kindness in the space. And as he's saying this, I'm thinking to myself, well, look, this is what we do. We bring people together in space, and what are we doing if not sanctifying kindness? I think, you know, difficult conversations are not possible to have unless we have that baseline. The second thing he said to me was, we are building relatives. This is not about allyship. Allyship is super important, but unless we are building relatives, then you don't know what it feels like to be in my shoes. And then how can I expect you to be on this journey with me? And then he said, if you're building relatives, and you are sanctifying kindness, then essentially what you are doing is building ethical space. And as he's saying these things, and this elder is not an artist by any stretch of the imagination, but he's saying these things to me, and I was like, well, isn't that what we do? I mean, ISPA has created this beautiful ethical space in this room right now where we get to have these conversations. And so I think to myself, finding these parallels are super important. And I could spend another hour talking about the idea of social business and how ironic it is that our work product is a social product that we put on stage, and yet when you pull back the curtains, everything is the opposite of social business, as you can imagine. So there's just so much incredible learnings that I benefited from, and ultimately the organization benefited from. Finally, there's this idea of leadership, because I didn't want in the book to give people the impression that everything was terrible and everything sucked and nobody out there is doing the right work, because many of you are and many of us are, or trying to. But I shine a light on an organization here in New York called the Laundromat Project. And I highlighted it, and I'm sure every one of us, regardless of where we come from, have that version of Laundromat Project in our own community. But the reason I highlight the Laundromat Project is because it is an organization that has been around for a few decades now, and its premise, as might seem obvious, is bringing the arts into laundromats in communities around New York City. It started in the South Bronx and Central Brooklyn. And in talking to their executive director, what she says to me, she says, the fact that bringing the arts into a laundromat is considered innovative is what is wrong with our world. Because when you have arts experiences that have become luxury goods that are overconsumed by too few people, bringing the arts into a space as basic and as simple as a laundromat is world-changing. And so you have these smaller, nimbler organizations that by definition are engaging and responding to community, but are also having a really hard time because their size doesn't allow them to be sustainable. And so what we explore in this final chapter is to say, how do we embrace the ethos of the Laundromat Project and be responsive and be relationship driven, but also understand that there are economies of scale and operational factors that allow us to be sustainable when we grow and partner together. I'm coming up on time, but I want to share one anecdote. And I apologize for those of you that have already heard me share it, but I feel like it encompasses what I would like everybody to get out of this provocation. So many, many years ago, I was teaching at Pace University down the road here. And one of the things I love about Pace University, unlike many other universities in New York City, is that it is 70% of the students identify as racial, ethnic, or cultural minorities, and it is the #1 university in the United States in terms of upward economic mobility, which is a fabulous statistic. And I was teaching this course in the business class around audience development, which is now a phrase that I hate. And we can talk about that over lunch. But this one student, raises his hand and says to me, he was like, "Mister, how much did you pay for your shoes?" And I was like, I don't know, maybe $80 for these shoes. And he points to his and he says, "I paid $400 for these Nike shoes." He says, "I'm taking my girlfriend to see Beyonce at Yankee Stadium next week, and I'm paying $500 to $600 a ticket." He says, "Don't assume, because of the color of my skin or the zip code that I live in, that I don't have disposable income." He says, "If I'm not spending money on your shows, it's not because I'm poor, it's because I don't give a shit." And I think as organizations, and listen, I am a firm believer that the financial barrier is one that needs to be overcome and needs to be explored immediately. But I also fear that we have projected this financial barrier on experiences that people just don't want or care about. So now we're actually shooting ourselves in the foot twice, because we are doing things and creating experiences that people don't want, and then we're offering them at a discount. So I hope I have offered some provocations this morning. And I know that the session that is coming immediately after is fascinating, and hopefully some of this conversation has primed us to take that in. Thank you all very much for having me. It's an honor to be here.